Today, we are going to talk about greed, hatred, and delusion, the three poisons in Theravada Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha, who lived in India in the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Lord Gautama Buddha was born into a royal family as Prince Siddhartha in a place called Lumbini in the present-day Nepal. Being a royal prince, he grew up with all the royal comforts, and he was prevented from seeing any human suffering outside the palace. However, as a young adult, he witnessed human suffering in the form of old age, illness, and death. When he came to know that human suffering is common to everybody, including himself and his loved ones, that alarmed and shocked him. And he developed a desire to find a way out of human suffering. So at the age of 29, he left home and became a homeless ascetic, wanting to find a way out of human suffering. For the next 6 years, he practiced severe austerity and self-mortification, believing that it will bring enlightenment and liberation from all suffering. But it did not. So he gave it up and started meditating under a tree in a place called Bodh Gaya in India. And he was successful. Through meditation, he was able to eradicate all his mental defilements and realize the Four Noble Truths. And by realizing the Four Noble Truths, he attained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha. The Four Noble Truths that the Buddha realized during the process of enlightenment are the truth of suffering, dukkha satcha, the truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya satcha, the truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha satcha, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga satcha. Now, having attained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha, the Buddha decided to teach the Buddhist doctrine and the path of liberation to others so that they could also cultivate the same path and liberate themselves from suffering. So for the next 45 years, the Buddha traveled around India teaching his doctrine and the Buddhist path of liberation. And the Buddha often said, I teach only two things, suffering and end of suffering. Now, Buddha said, it is due to the accumulation of various mental defilements that causes suffering and the continuation in the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. So, in order to escape from suffering and the cycle of birth and death, one needs to eradicate those mental defilements. And Buddha describes several groups of such mental defilements, which have considerable overlap between them. And these defilements also operate at different levels of consciousness. One group of mental defilements that operate at a subconscious level is what are called latent tendencies, anusaya dhamma. And the Buddha described 7 such latent tendencies. Latent tendency of desire for sensual pleasures, aversion, conceit, wrong view, doubt, desire for existence, and ignorance. Now, another group of mental defilements that the Buddha described are what are called fermentations or taints, influxes, asava in the Pali language. And the 4 fermentations are sense desire, desire for continued existence, wrong views, and ignorance. The Buddha also described another group of 10 mental defilements called fetters, sangyojana. Now, these fetters are chains or shackles that bind the sentient beings to the cycle of birth and death. And the 10 fetters that the Buddha described are self-identity view, sakkaya ditthi, skeptical doubt, vichikicha, attachment to mere rites and rituals, silabbata paramasa, sensual desire, kamaraga, ill will, patiga, desire to be born in fine material Brahma worlds, ruparaga, desire to be born in formless Brahma worlds, aruparaga, conceit, mana, restlessness, uddhacha, and ignorance, avijja. Now, according to Buddhist teaching, these and all the other mental defilements that cause suffering and continuation in the cycle of birth and death are all based on 3 unwholesome roots. And in a discourse called Mula Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, that is the collection of the Buddha's numerical discourses, the Buddha described the 3 unwholesome roots. And the Buddha said, greed is a root of what is unskillful. Hatred is a root of what is unskillful. Delusion is a root of what is unskillful. And in a book called Itivuttaka, that is one of the 15 books of the Khuddaka Nikaya, collection of the Buddha's minor discourses, the Buddha likened the 3 unwholesome roots to fires burning inside oneself. Buddha said, monks, there are these 3 fires: the fire of greed, the fire of hatred, and the fire of delusion. So the 3 unwholesome roots are greed, hatred, delusion. Now, greed, lobha, is the desire to experience happy, pleasant sensory experiences through the 6 internal sense doors, that is the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. Hatred, dosa, includes all degrees of ill will, animosity, aversion, anger, and annoyance. And delusion, moha, is the distorted thinking and wrong belief about the reality of all existing phenomena. The Buddha has said that all existing phenomena, physical and mental, they are all impermanent, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and there is no self, anatta. In the Salayaka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, which is a collection of the Buddha's middle-length discourses, the Buddha described 10 unwholesome actions, and they included 3 types of bodily actions, 4 types of verbal actions, and 3 types of mental actions. The 3 unwholesome bodily actions are killing any living beings, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And the 4 unwholesome verbal actions are false speech, slanderous speech, harsh speech, and idle chattering. And the 3 unwholesome mental actions are covetousness, abhijja, or greed, ill will, and wrong view. Now, in a discourse called Kamma Nidana Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha said that all these 10 unwholesome actions are conditioned either by greed, hatred, or delusion. So, in all the 10 unwholesome actions, the 3 unwholesome roots are active. And a discourse called Tittiya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha described the differences between the 3 roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. Buddha said, greed carries little blame and is slow to fade away. Hatred carries great blame and is quick to fade away. And delusion carries great blame and is slow to fade away. In the Kalama Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha said how these 3 unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion lead people to commit unwholesome actions. And they also encourage other people to commit the same unwholesome actions. Buddha said, and this greedy person, overcome by greed, his mind possessed by greed, kills living beings, steals, commits adultery, tells lies, and encourages others to do the same. And they all cause long-term harm and suffering. And Buddha described hatred and delusion in a similar way. Now, the basic human nature is to seek pleasure and happiness and to avoid pain and unhappiness. So, this greed is the burning desire to obtain any objects of one's sensual desire, believing that those objects will bring pleasure, satisfaction, and happiness. And greed can manifest in various ways, such as liking, longing, love, fondness and affection, attachment, lust, passion, craving, possessiveness, selfishness, and the desire for the five sense objects, desire for wealth, fame, popularity, status, power, and it goes on. So greed is this inner drive that can never be satisfied or fulfilled. Now, when one obtains an object of desire, there is some pleasure, happiness, and satisfaction, but that is very transient. And because they are impermanent and transient by their very nature, this pleasure and satisfaction doesn't last long. And when it disappears, that causes displeasure, dissatisfaction, and suffering. And that creates this never ending, unquenchable appetite to obtain either the same pleasure or different pleasures. And in the Titya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha said, the reason for the arising of greed is one's unwise attention towards any pleasurable objects that one receives through the sensory basis of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind. Now, greed is the result of both delusion and ignorance. Now, because of the delusion of believing in an I or me, one believes that this I or me should enjoy sensual pleasures. And then, because of the ignorance of the reality of all physical and mental phenomena, we take what is unattractive as attractive, impermanent as permanent, suffering as pleasurable, and not self as self. And because of these wrong beliefs, one tries to obtain these external objects of desire, thinking that those objects will bring pleasure and happiness that will last. Now, another wrong belief we have is that we can obtain this pleasure and happiness only from external objects. And when one object doesn't bring the happiness and the pleasure that one expected, then obviously the appetite to seek even more objects of pleasure arises. Now, greed exists in different forms until one attains full enlightenment and the state of Nibbana. Now, greed can easily lead to the poison of hatred. Now, if one cannot obtain the objects of desire that one wanted, then that can lead to one feeling resentment and anger towards oneself. And that can easily lead to states of depression or even self-harm and suicide. If one sees other people are obstructing that one's attempt to get the objects of one's desire, then the anger, hatred towards them develop. And that can lead to verbal and physical violence, even murder. And the other negative aspects of greed are that one can become quite selfish, with no empathy or compassion, generosity for anybody else. And some can even exploit and manipulate other people to get one's objects of desire. So greed can result in immense suffering to oneself, to others, and both to oneself and others. And because greed is an unwholesome mental action, it can also lead to rebirth in suffering worlds. And of course, it can prolong our existence in the cycle of birth and death and keep us away from the Buddhist path of liberation from suffering. Now, hatred is also described as ill will, aversion, and anger. And this hatred can manifest in various ways. It may manifest as unhappiness, fear, dislike, despair, disappointment, frustration, revulsion, disgust, resentment, irritability, annoyance, grudge, antagonism, vengefulness, wishing harm on others, rage, harsh words, physical violence. And this hatred is influenced by both ignorance and greed. Ignorance about the true reality of all mental and physical phenomena. And when one cannot obtain the objects that one desires, and also when one realizes the transient nature of those sensual objects, that can lead to hatred and anger. Anger can also arise with negative experience with other people or objects or events that are taking place at the present time. But one can even develop anger by remembering things that had happened in the past. And one can develop anger when one receives painful, unpleasant, disagreeable sense objects through our sense doors. And also when one faces disappointment, frustration, annoyance, injustice, and any form of loss. And this anger and hatred could be towards oneself, towards others, or even towards objects and events. Now, the real reason for anger is not the external object of anger, but because we have this unwholesome root of hatred in our mind that can influence our thinking pattern at the time. Now, in the Titiya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha stated that the reason for the development of hatred is unwise attention to unpleasant objects that we receive through our six sense doors. Hatred exists as a latent tendency, the Patiganusaya, and it is one of the five mental hindrances, Vyapada. It's one of the 10 fetters, Samyojana, the Patiga, and it's also one of the 10 unwholesome actions. And hatred is completely eradicated only when one becomes a non-returner, anagami, in the Buddhist path of liberation. In a discourse called Kodana Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha described 7 negative consequences of anger. When one becomes angry, one becomes ugly and miserable, and one sleeps poorly. One will not be successful or prosperous, and one is bound to lose rightly earned wealth due to taking decisions in anger. One will lose reputation and friends and relatives. And of course, being an unwholesome action, one is likely to be reborn in the worlds of suffering. In another discourse called Leka Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha described three types of individuals in relation to anger. Now, one individual is like an inscription in rock. He gets angry very often, and the anger stays for a long time. Some individuals are like a line drawn in soil. They get angry often, but the anger doesn't last long. And some other individuals are like a line drawn in water. They get angry very rarely, and even then, the anger doesn't last long. So, hatred can also cause immense suffering to oneself and others, and also rebirth in the worlds of extreme suffering because it's an unwholesome action. And it will prolong one's existence in the cycle of birth and death and keep one away from the Buddhist path of liberation from suffering. Hatred is also completely eradicated when one becomes a non-returner, anagami, in the Buddhist path of liberation. Pali word moha means delusion, ignorance, or wrong view. And that's the lack of awareness of the true reality of all the mental and physical phenomena in the world. And it is due to this delusion that one develops the four mental perversions, seen unattractive as attractive, impermanent as permanent, suffering as pleasurable, and not self as self. Now, unlike greed and hatred, delusion can operate on its own. But greed and hatred, they arise due to delusion and cannot arise without delusion. Now, it is because of the ignorance that one believes that happiness comes only from outside. And when one attempts to obtain those objects of desire from outside, if they cannot get them, then hatred arises. Fundamental to all delusions is the belief in a self or a permanent ego within ourselves. And all the other delusions arise from that. Now, the Buddha has said that what we call a person or an individual is nothing but a psychophysical complex that is made up of five aggregates of clinging. And the five aggregates of clinging are form or matter, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formation, sankhara, and consciousness, vijnana. And all these five aggregates are transient, impermanent, and they are all in a state of flux with no stability. And when one believes that the five aggregates are permanent and identify with them as I or me, then of course suffering is inevitable. In the Titya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha said that delusion arises due to unwise attention. Now, ignorance is the first of the 12 factors of dependent origination, paticca samuppada. Now, dependent origination is the process that explains the origin of suffering and our continuation in the cycle of birth and death. Ignorance is also the last of the 7 latent tendencies, last of the 4 fermentations, and last of the 10 fetters. Now, until these 3 unwholesome roots, greed, hatred, and delusion, are completely eradicated, there is no end of suffering or the cycle of birth and death. In the Itivuttaka book, the Buddha has said, it is only when one eradicates these 3 root defilements that one crosses the ocean of samsara and attains Nibbana. Now, initially, to some extent, one can weaken the 3 unwholesome roots using the antidotes. Now, the antidote to greed is practicing generosity, letting go, and also reflecting on impermanence of the objects that we desire and their dangers. Antidote to hatred is to practice loving kindness, metta. Now, loving kindness can be practiced as loving kindness meditation, metta bhavana, spreading metta to either identified people or to all living beings. The antidote to delusion is insight, wisdom, or right understanding. In a discourse called Samma Ditti Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, Arahant Sariputta, who was one of the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha, said, when a noble disciple understands the unwholesome, the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome, and the root of the wholesome, in that way, he is one of right view. That is Samma Ditti. And Arahant Sariputta continued, and what is the root of the unwholesome? Greed is the root of the unwholesome. Hatred is the root of the unwholesome. Delusion is the root of the unwholesome. And in another discourse called Nibbana Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, that is the collection of the Buddha's connected discourses, a wandering ascetic asked Arahant Sariputta what Nibbana is and what the path to Nibbana is. And Arahant Sariputta said, total eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion is Nibbana. And the path to Nibbana is the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, the Noble Eightfold Path, or the Buddhist path of liberation from suffering, has 8 factors. Right view, Samadhi; right intention, Samma Sankappa; right speech, Samma Vacha; right action, Samma Kammanta; right livelihood, Samma Ajiva; right effort, Samma Vayama; right mindfulness, Samma Sati; and right concentration, Samma Samadhi. Now, for practical purposes, the 8 factors can be divided into 3 groups of practice. The first group is morality, sila, and that consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is concentration, samadhi, and that consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the third group is wisdom, panya, and that consists of right understanding and right intention. Now, when one cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path successfully with diligence, as advised by the Buddha, one can attain enlightenment through four progressive supramundane stages. The first stage is stream enterer, Srotapanna. The second stage is once returner, Sakadagami. The third stage is non-returner, Anagami. And the final and the fourth stage of enlightenment is Arahant. Our stream enterer has weakened the three unwholesome roots, greed, hatred, and delusion, to such an extent that a stream enterer will not commit any unwholesome actions that can lead to a rebirth in any of the suffering worlds. The once returner continues to reduce the three unwholesome roots, and when one becomes a non-returner, anagami, the two fetters of desire for sensual pleasures, kamaraga, and hatred, patiga, are completely eradicated. An arahant has eradicated ignorance and all the other mental defilements completely to attain enlightenment and nibbana. Thank you very much.